When the world gets too loud. 2 in the morning. The kitchen is dark except for the glow of the refrigerator. Someone stands there, frozen, staring at shelves full of food they're not hungry for, unable to move or think or do anything except wonder how they got to this point. Upstairs, the family sleeps. On the desk, a presentation sits unfinished, due in 6 hours. None of that matters right now because something inside has simply stopped working. This isn't crying or panicking or what anyone would call a breakdown. This is something quieter and more terrifying. It's the moment when everything goes offline. If you've seen the Pixar movie Inside Out, you know that scene where Riley's control panel goes dark and nothing works anymore. That's what this feels like. The lights are on, but nobody's home. The brain shuts down, overwhelmed by the weight of everything it's been carrying for longer than it wants to admit. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you've had your own 2 a.m. moment standing in front of the fridge, or sitting in your car in the parking lot before work, or lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering if this is all there is. Maybe you've looked in the mirror and wondered when you became this person, someone who's always tired, always on edge, always one bad day away from completely falling apart. If that's you, here's something you need to know. This isn't weakness, and it's not failure, and you're not the only one who feels this way. Imagine a tree standing in the middle of a storm. The wind howls and pushes against the branches, bending them until they creak under the pressure. The rain batters the leaves, tearing some of them away and scattering them across the ground. The tree sways and bends and loses parts of itself with every gust. But it doesn't break. Why? Because deep beneath the surface, buried where the storm can't reach, there are roots, strong, deep roots that anchor the tree to the earth and hold it steady even when everything above ground is chaos. Your baseline is like those roots. It's the part of you that exists beneath all the noise, beneath all the expectations and obligations and crises that fill your days. It's the steady, quiet center of who you are when you strip away everything else. The place you return to when you finally stop moving long enough to catch your breath. The problem is that most people have been living in the storm for so long that they've forgotten what those roots even feel like. They think the constant bending and swaying is just how life is supposed to be. That if they're not exhausted and overwhelmed, then they must not be doing enough. That's the lie we've all been sold, the idea that more is better and busy is noble and rest is for people who don't have real responsibilities. We've been taught to ignore the signs of overload, to push through the exhaustion and the anxiety and the bone-deep fatigue because that's what strong people do. But living that way doesn't make you strong. It makes you brittle, and eventually, something breaks. This isn't a book about a system you need to memorize or a 10-step plan you need to follow perfectly. What you'll find here is a conversation, the kind you'd have with someone who understands where you are and knows there's a way back. We'll talk about what it means to be overwhelmed, what happens in your brain and your body when you push past your limits, and why finding your baseline isn't about achieving some perfect state of calm, but about remembering who you are when the storm finally stops. You'll hear stories from people who've lived through this and come out the other side. Some of them ordinary people facing the same struggles you face, and some of them public figures who've been brave enough to admit that they hit a wall. You'll learn about the science behind emotional overload, why it happens, and what can be done about it. And yes, you'll get techniques and tools that work today, right now, in the middle of real life, when you're juggling a job and a family and a million other things that won't wait. What you won't find here is judgment about how you got to this point, or suggestions that you should have known better or that this is somehow your fault. Life is loud and relentless and often unfair, and sometimes the best anyone can do is survive until they're ready to do more than survive. If you're reading this, you're ready. Maybe you don't feel ready. Maybe you feel like you're barely holding on. But the fact that you're here means something in you is still fighting, still looking for a way forward, even when everything feels impossible. So let's talk about what happens when the world gets too loud, when you lose touch with your baseline and forget what it feels like to be anything other than overwhelmed. Let's talk about how people get here, why it matters, and what can be done to find the way back. This isn't about fixing yourself, because you're not broken. This is about remembering who you are beneath the noise, about finding those roots again and trusting that they're still there, waiting for you to come home. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of Overwhelm. Why everything feels too much. Marina thought she was fine until the day she couldn't remember her daughter's middle name. She was 42 years old, sitting at her kitchen table filling out a school form, when her mind went completely blank. Not tired blank or distracted blank, but genuinely, terrifyingly empty. She stared at the line on the paper where the name should go, knowing it was something she'd written 1,000 times before, and found nothing there. Just silence. Her daughter walked into the room and asked what was for dinner, and Marina looked at her like she'd asked a question in a foreign language. The words made sense individually, but strung together, they might as well have been nonsense. That's when she knew something was wrong. Not wrong in the way a bad day is wrong or the way stress feels when you have too much on your plate. This was different. This was her brain shutting down mid-task, refusing to cooperate, giving up without her permission. She'd been running at full capacity for so long that she'd forgotten what normal felt like. And now her body was making the decision for her. Emotional overload doesn't announce itself with sirens or warning lights. It creeps up slowly, day by day, until one morning you wake up and realize you've been living in survival mode for months or maybe years without noticing. You think you're managing because you're still showing up, still getting things done, still holding it together on the outside. What you don't see is what's happening beneath the surface. The slow accumulation of stress and pressure and demands that your nervous system was never designed to handle indefinitely. In August of 2021, Simone Biles shocked the world when she withdrew from the Olympic gymnastics competition in Tokyo. She was the greatest gymnast alive, the favorite to win multiple gold medals, and she stepped back mid-competition because she knew she wasn't okay. The media called it the twisties, a phenomenon where gymnasts lose their sense of spatial awareness in mid-air. But what Simone described was simpler and more terrifying than that. She said she didn't recognize herself anymore. She'd pushed so hard for so long that she lost track of where she ended and the performance began. And continuing would have been dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. That's what emotional overload looks like when you're willing to admit it. Most people aren't. Most people keep going until their bodies force them to stop. Until they can't remember their daughter's middle name, or they break down in a parking lot, or they stand in their kitchen at 2 a.m. wondering how they got here. The American Psychological Association releases an annual report called Stress in America, and the numbers paint a picture that most people already know from living it. In 2023, 77% of Americans reported experiencing physical symptoms caused by stress, things like headaches, fatigue, and muscle tension that wouldn't go away, no matter how much rest they tried to get. 63% said their stress levels had increased over the past year. And when asked what was causing it, the answers ranged from money to work to family to politics to the sheer relentless pace of modern life that never seems to slow down. What those numbers don't capture is the feeling of it, the lived experience of being so overloaded that you stop noticing how bad it's gotten. You adjust. You normalize. You convince yourself that everyone feels this way, and that complaining about it makes you weak or ungrateful or less capable than the people around you who seem to be handling things just fine. Except they're not handling it fine. They're just better at hiding it, or they haven't hit their breaking point yet. Here's what happens in your brain when you're emotionally overloaded. Your nervous system operates on a simple premise: survive first, think later. When it detects a threat, whether that's a physical danger or an emotional stressor, it activates your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for the fight or flight response. This is useful when you're being chased by something that wants to eat you. It's less useful when the threat is an overflowing inbox, a fight with your partner, financial pressure, or the feeling that you're failing at everything you're trying to juggle. The problem is that your amygdala can't tell the difference between a life-threatening emergency and a stressful Tuesday. It responds the same way to both, flooding your system with cortisol and adrenaline, shutting down non-essential functions like rational thinking and memory, and preparing your body to either fight or run. If this happens occasionally, your system recovers. If it happens constantly, you end up living in a state of chronic activation where your brain is always on high alert and never gets a chance to reset. When that happens, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, planning, and impulse control, starts to go offline. That's why you forget your daughter's middle name. That's why small decisions feel impossible. That's why you snap at people over things that wouldn't normally bother you. Your brain is so busy trying to keep you alive that it doesn't have the resources left over for anything else. You might recognize these signs in yourself. Maybe you've noticed that you're forgetful in ways you never used to be, losing track of conversations mid-sentence or walking into a room and forgetting why you went there. Maybe you're irritable, snapping at people you love over minor annoyances that wouldn't have registered a year ago. Maybe you're exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix, waking up tired no matter how many hours you got. Maybe you can't focus, staring at your computer screen for 30 minutes without accomplishing anything because your brain refuses to engage. Maybe you're overwhelmed by decisions that should be simple, standing in the grocery store unable to choose between 2 brands of pasta because your mind has already hit its limit for the day. These are the 10 signs that you're on emotional overload, the red flags that your nervous system is maxed out and begging for relief. You're forgetful, irritable, exhausted, unfocused, and paralyzed by small decisions. You're also withdrawn, pulling away from people and activities you used to enjoy because you don't have the energy to pretend you're okay. You're anxious, feeling a constant low-level hum of dread that something's about to go wrong even when there's no specific threat. You're physically tense, carrying stress in your shoulders, your jaw, your stomach in ways that leave you sore and aching. You're emotionally numb, going through the motions without feeling much of anything because feeling would require energy you don't have. And you're running on autopilot, moving through your day without really being present because presence requires more than you can give right now. If you're reading this and checking off most of those signs, you're not alone. This is happening to millions of people right now. And it's not because you're weak or because you're doing something wrong. It's because the world we live in is louder, faster, and more demanding than it's ever been. And your nervous system wasn't designed for this. Think about what's changed in the last 20 years. You're connected to everyone all the time through your phone, which means work never really ends, and there's no such thing as being unreachable. You're bombarded with information 24 hours a day, most of it designed to make you angry or scared or envious, because those emotions drive engagement. You're expected to be productive, present, informed, and involved in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. And if you're over 40, You're dealing with all of this while also managing the responsibilities that come with being an adult, things like aging parents, financial obligations, career pressures, and the quiet creeping realization that time is finite, and you haven't accomplished everything you thought you would by now. This is why emotional overload is happening to so many people in midlife. It's not just that you have more on your plate than you did at 25. It's that you've been carrying that weight for decades, and the cumulative effect of all those years is catching up with you. Your nervous system has been running on fumes for so long that it's forgotten how to do anything else. And now even the smallest additional stressor feels like the thing that's going to break you. But here's what most people don't know. And this is the part that changes everything. Your brain is capable of healing. It's capable of learning new patterns, of resetting that overactive stress response, of finding its way back to a state where you're not constantly on the edge of collapse. The damage isn't permanent. The exhaustion isn't inevitable. You're not stuck like this forever. That's what the rest of this book is about. Not just understanding why you're overwhelmed, but learning how to find your way back to the part of yourself that exists beneath all the noise. It starts with recognizing that you're not broken, you're overloaded, and there's a difference. Chapter 2. Your brain on overload. The science behind the shutdown. Picture a glass sitting on a table. Every time something stressful happens, a drop of water falls into the glass. A tight deadline at work, a drop. An argument with your partner, a drop. Traffic that makes you late, bills you can't pay, news that makes you anxious, a parent who needs help, a child who's struggling, a friend who's disappointed, a body that's aging in ways you didn't expect. All of it adding drops to the glass, one after another, until the water level rises higher and higher. Most of the time, you don't notice the accumulation. You handle each stressor as it comes, convinced that you're managing fine because the glass hasn't overflowed yet. What you don't realize is that the glass never empties. The water doesn't evaporate between crises. It just sits there, building up slowly over days and weeks and months, until one more drop, one tiny additional thing that shouldn't matter, causes the whole thing to overflow. That's the stress bucket model. A concept developed by researchers trying to explain why people break down over seemingly minor events. It's not that the final stressor was particularly significant. It's that the bucket was already full, and there was no room left for anything else. When people say they lost it over something small, they're not exaggerating or being dramatic. They're describing what happens when a system that's been maxed out for too long finally runs out of capacity. Your brain operates on a similar principle. It has a limited amount of resources to allocate at any given time. And when those resources are consumed by stress, there's nothing left over for the things that make you functional. Memory, focus, emotional regulation, decision-making, all of these require energy that your brain can only provide when it's not in survival mode. When stress becomes chronic, when the drops keep falling faster than the bucket can drain, your brain shifts into a state of permanent crisis management and everything else shuts down. Daniel Goleman, a psychologist who spent decades studying emotional intelligence, coined the term amygdala hijack to describe what happens when stress overwhelms your brain's capacity to think rationally. The amygdala, that small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, is designed to detect threats and activate your fight-or-flight response before you have time to consciously process what's happening. This is useful when you need to react instantly to avoid danger. It's disastrous when the threat is everyday stress that your amygdala treats like a life-or-death emergency. When your amygdala hijacks your brain, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic and reasoning and impulse control, goes offline. Blood flow shifts away from it and toward the parts of your brain that handle survival. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your breathing becomes shallow. and your ability to think clearly disappears. This state is supposed to last only a few minutes, just long enough to get you out of immediate danger. But when you're living in chronic stress, your amygdala stays activated for hours, days, or even weeks at a time, and your prefrontal cortex never gets a chance to come back online. Research from Harvard Medical School has shown that elevated cortisol levels, the hormone your body releases during stress, actively impair the functioning of your prefrontal cortex. Cortisol is supposed to help you respond to short-term threats by giving you a burst of energy and heightening your senses. In small doses, it's helpful. In constant, unrelenting doses, it becomes toxic. High cortisol interferes with memory formation, disrupts sleep, weakens your immune system, and makes it nearly impossible to regulate your emotions. It's why you can't remember where you put your keys when you're stressed. It's why you snap at people you love over things that normally wouldn't bother you. It's why everything feels harder than it should. Think about the last time you had to make a decision while you were overwhelmed. Maybe it was something as simple as choosing what to eat for dinner or deciding whether to say yes to an invitation. If you were in a state of overload, that decision probably felt impossible. You might have stood in front of the refrigerator for 10 minutes, unable to settle on anything. You might have stared at your phone, paralyzed by the thought of committing to plans when you could barely manage the obligations you already had. This isn't laziness or indecision. It's your prefrontal cortex operating at reduced capacity because all your brain's resources are being diverted to managing stress. The drops in the bucket don't just come from external events. They also come from internal ones. The thoughts you can't shut off, the worries that loop endlessly in your mind, the guilt over things you should have done differently, the fear that you're failing at everything that matters. Your brain doesn't distinguish between a real threat and an imagined one. If you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation you had 6 months ago and convincing yourself that everyone thinks you're incompetent, your amygdala responds as if that threat is happening right now. The cortisol flows, the stress accumulates, and the bucket fills up whether the danger is real or not. Here's what makes this worse. The more stressed you are, the more sensitive your amygdala becomes to potential threats. It's like turning up the volume on a smoke detector until it goes off every time you toast bread. Your brain starts interpreting neutral or even positive events as stressors because it's stuck in a pattern of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for the next thing that's going to go wrong. Someone asks you a harmless question, and you hear criticism. A friend cancels plans, and you assume they're pulling away. Your boss sends an email asking to talk, and you're convinced you're about to be fired. None of these interpretations are necessarily accurate. But your brain doesn't care about accuracy when it's in survival mode. It cares about keeping you alert to danger, even if that means seeing danger everywhere. This is why stress compounds. Each new stressor doesn't just add to the bucket. It also makes you more reactive to the next one, which makes you more reactive to the one after that, until you're living in a state where everything feels like too much because your nervous system is stuck on high alert and can't reset. But there's something most people don't know about the brain, something that changes the entire story. Your brain is not fixed. It's not locked into patterns that can't be changed. It has something called neuroplasticity, the ability to form new neural pathways, to rewire itself based on your experiences and behaviors. The damage caused by chronic stress isn't permanent. The overactive amygdala can be calmed. The prefrontal cortex can come back online. The bucket can be drained. Neuroplasticity means that the brain you have right now, the one that's exhausted and overloaded and struggling to function, is not the brain you're stuck with forever. It means that with the right strategies, the right practices, and the right understanding of how your nervous system works, you can teach your brain to respond differently to stress. You can lower the baseline activation of your amygdala. You can strengthen the pathways in your prefrontal cortex that help you think clearly and make decisions. You can reset the system that's been running on empty for too long. This isn't about positive thinking or pretending stress doesn't exist. It's about understanding that your brain responds to what you give it. And right now, you've been giving it an endless stream of drops with no opportunity to drain the bucket. When you start changing that, when you start creating space for your nervous system to reset, your brain begins to adapt. It learns that it doesn't have to stay in crisis mode all the time. It remembers what it feels like to function from a place of calm instead of constant emergency. The science of stress is not a life sentence. It's a map. It shows you why you feel the way you do, why everything seems harder than it should be, and why small things feel overwhelming when they didn't used to. Understanding the map doesn't make the stress disappear, but it does give you a starting point for finding your way back. Chapter 3. The myth we all believed. Why more isn't better. In 2018, Elon Musk gave an interview to the New York Times that shocked a lot of people, though maybe it shouldn't have. He admitted that he'd been working 120-hour weeks, sleeping on the factory floor at Tesla, and taking Ambien to fall asleep because his mind wouldn't stop racing long enough to rest naturally. He described the past year as the most difficult and painful of his career, saying that there were times when he didn't leave the factory for 3 or 4 days straight, that he was working so much he barely saw his kids, and that his friends were worried he was burning out in ways that might not be reversible. This is a man who's built electric car companies and space exploration programs, someone the world celebrates as a visionary and a genius. And yet, when you strip away the admiration and the accomplishments, what you're left with is a human being who was destroying himself in the name of productivity, who believed that the only way to succeed was to sacrifice everything else, including his health, his relationships, and his ability to function like a person instead of a machine. The culture we live in doesn't just allow this. It celebrates it. It holds up people like Musk as examples of what dedication looks like, as proof that if you want to achieve great things, you have to be willing to grind yourself into dust to get there. You've probably seen The Pursuit of Happiness, the movie where Will Smith plays Chris Gardner, a man who spends months homeless with his young son while chasing a career in finance. The story ends with him getting the job and turning his life around, and the movie frames this as a triumph of persistence and hard work. And it is, in a lot of ways. But what the movie doesn't talk about much is the cost of that pursuit, the toll it takes on a person to live without stability or rest for that long, to push through exhaustion and fear and uncertainty, because stopping feels like giving up. We celebrate the ending because he made it. But we don't talk about what happens to the people who push just as hard and don't make it, or who make it but lose themselves along the way. The myth we've all been sold is simple. More is better. More work equals more success. More effort equals more results. More hustle, more hours, more sacrifice, more pushing through when your body is begging you to stop. The culture tells you that if you're not exhausted, you're not trying hard enough. If you're not busy, you're lazy. If you set boundaries, you're not committed. And if you fail, it's because you didn't want it badly enough or you weren't willing to do what it takes. This myth is everywhere. It's in the motivational quotes that flood social media, the ones that say things like, sleep when you're dead, or no days off, or hustle until your haters ask if you're hiring. It's in the way we talk about successful people, focusing on how many hours they work instead of how sustainable their lives are. It's in the workplace culture that rewards people who stay late and answer emails at midnight and never take vacations, treating rest like a weakness instead of a biological necessity. It's so deeply embedded in how we think about achievement that most people don't even question it anymore. They just accept that this is how life works, that suffering is the price of success, and that if they're not willing to pay it, they don't deserve what they're trying to build. But what the myth doesn't tell you is that it's a losing game. You can't win by playing it, because the rules are designed to keep you running forever without ever reaching a finish line. There's always more work to do, more goals to hit, more ways you could be doing better if only you tried harder. The treadmill never stops, and the people who stay on it long enough don't end up victorious. They end up broken. David was one of those people. He spent 20 years building a career in finance, working 80-hour weeks, missing his kids' childhoods, sacrificing his marriage and his health because he believed that once he hit a certain level of success, everything would be worth it. He'd be able to slow down then, to enjoy the life he'd been working so hard to build. But the level he was chasing kept moving. Every promotion brought new responsibilities, new expectations, new reasons why he couldn't ease up yet. And by the time he was 50, he'd achieved everything he set out to do on paper. But he didn't recognize the person staring back at him in the mirror. His wife had left him 3 years earlier. His kids were adults he barely knew, people he'd see at holidays and struggled to make conversation with because they'd grown up without him, and he'd missed all the moments that mattered. His body was a mess, high blood pressure and chronic back pain and a digestive system that had stopped functioning properly years ago. And the career he'd sacrificed everything for felt hollow, like a monument to a life he'd never actually lived. He told someone later that the worst part wasn't the regret, though there was plenty of that. It was the realization that he'd spent 2 decades chasing something that wasn't real, that the promised payoff for all that suffering had never existed in the first place. This is what the culture of more is better does. It convinces you that your worth is measured by your output, that rest is optional, and that the only way to prove you're valuable is to keep producing until there's nothing left of you. It tells you that balance is for people who aren't serious, that self-care is indulgent, and that if you're struggling, it's because you're not tough enough to handle what success requires. And by the time you realize you've been lied to, you've already paid the price in ways that can't be undone. The truth is that more isn't better. More is just more. And past a certain point, it stops adding value and starts taking it away. Working longer hours doesn't make you more productive. It makes you less effective because your brain can't function properly when it's exhausted. Saying yes to every opportunity doesn't create success. It creates overload because you're spreading yourself so thin that nothing gets your full attention. Sacrificing your health and your relationships in the name of achievement doesn't build a better life. It destroys the foundation of the life you already have. You've probably felt the pull of this myth yourself. Maybe you've stayed late at work when you should have gone home, convincing yourself that just a few more hours would make a difference. Maybe you've said yes to things you didn't want to do because you were afraid that saying no would make you look uncommitted or lazy. Maybe you've pushed through exhaustion and ignored the signals your body was sending because you believed that stopping meant failure. And maybe, somewhere along the way, you started to notice that the more you gave, the less you seemed to have, that the harder you worked, the further away peace and stability felt. That's not a personal failing. That's the myth doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is keep you running until you break. The culture doesn't care if you break, because there's always someone else willing to step onto the treadmill and try their luck. What it can't afford is for you to step off the treadmill and realize that there's another way to live, one that doesn't require you to destroy yourself to prove your worth. The first step toward finding your baseline is recognizing that the game is rigged, that the promise of just a little more effort and you'll get there is a lie designed to keep you chasing something that will never be enough. You don't need to work harder. You don't need to sacrifice more. What you need is to stop believing that your value comes from how much you can endure and start asking yourself what you're actually trying to build and whether the path you're on will ever get you there. Because the truth is, it won't. The myth of more is better doesn't lead to success. It leads to burnout, broken relationships, and a life you're too exhausted to enjoy. And the only way out is to stop playing by its rules and start writing your own. Chapter 4. What is your baseline, really? Remember the tree standing in the storm? Now imagine this. The storm has been raging for months. The wind hasn't stopped. The rain keeps falling. The branches bend so constantly that they've forgotten what it feels like to stand straight. The tree doesn't even notice the storm anymore, because this is all it knows now. The constant bending, the relentless pressure, the never-ending wind. This has become normal. The tree has adapted to crisis mode, and somewhere along the way, it forgot that there was ever a time when the air was still. That's what happens when you lose your baseline. You adapt to the chaos so completely that you stop recognizing it as chaos. You think this is just how life is, that everyone feels this way, that the exhaustion and the anxiety and the constant sense of being one step behind are simply part of being an adult. You don't realize you're living in survival mode because survival mode has become your default setting, and you've lost touch with what it felt like to exist any other way. Your baseline isn't happiness, though happiness can be part of it. It's not success or achievement or having everything figured out. It's something quieter and more fundamental than that. It's the state you return to when you're not reacting to a crisis, when you're not performing for someone else, when you're not pushing yourself to meet expectations that may not even be your own. It's the feeling of being grounded in yourself, of knowing who you are beneath all the roles you play and all the demands placed on you. It's the place where you can breathe without effort, where decisions don't feel impossible, where you're present in your own life instead of watching it pass by from a distance. Researchers who study well-being have a term for this. They call it the set point, the baseline level of happiness or emotional stability that people tend to return to over time, regardless of what happens to them. Sonia Lyubomirsky, a psychologist at Stanford University, spent years studying this phenomenon and found that about 50% of your emotional set point is genetically determined. Meaning some people are naturally inclined toward optimism, while others lean toward caution or melancholy. 10% comes from your circumstances. The external factors like where you live, how much money you make, or what's happening in your life at any given moment. And the remaining 40% comes from intentional activities, the choices you make, the habits you build, the way you respond to stress and difficulty. What that research tells you is that your baseline isn't fixed. It's not something you're stuck with forever based on luck or genetics. A significant portion of it is within your control, shaped by what you do and how you choose to live. But here's the part that most people don't understand. You can't access that 40%. You can't make choices that move you toward your baseline if you're so overloaded that you've lost touch with what your baseline even feels like. You can't choose calm if you don't remember what calm is. You can't build habits that support your well-being if you're too exhausted to recognize what well-being looks like for you. So before you can find your baseline again, you need to know what you're looking for. You need to identify what it feels like when you're grounded, when you're yourself, when you're operating from a place of stability instead of constant reaction. For some people, it's a physical sensation, a looseness in their chest or shoulders, a steadiness in their breathing that tells them they're okay. For others, it's mental clarity, the ability to think through a problem without their mind spinning in circles or shutting down completely. For others still, it's emotional, a sense of being connected to the people and things that matter without feeling like they're failing everyone all the time. Here are 5 characteristics that tend to show up when someone is living from their baseline. You feel present, able to focus on what's in front of you without your mind constantly jumping to the next crisis or replaying the last one. You feel capable, trusting that you can handle what comes up without needing to control every detail or prepare for every possible disaster. You feel connected, able to engage with the people around you in ways that feel genuine instead of performative or exhausting. You feel steady, not immune to stress or difficulty, but resilient enough that challenges don't knock you completely off course. And you feel like yourself, recognizing the person you are when you're not just reacting to external demands. If you're reading this and thinking that you can't remember the last time you felt any of those things, you're not alone. Most people who are overloaded have been away from their baseline for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to live any other way. They remember moments, maybe brief glimpses of calm or clarity that didn't last. But they can't access it as a sustained state because the storm has been raging too long and the tree has been bending for too many years. Here's a simple test to help you figure out how far you are from your baseline right now. Ask yourself these 5 questions and answer them honestly. Not with what you think you should say, but with what's actually true. 1. When was the last time you felt genuinely rested, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally? Not the kind of rest you get after a good night's sleep, though that matters too. But the deeper kind, where your nervous system isn't on high alert and your mind isn't running through lists of things you need to do. 2. When was the last time you made a decision without second-guessing yourself or asking for validation from someone else? A decision where you trusted your own judgment and didn't spend hours afterward wondering if you made the wrong choice. 3. When was the last time you felt excited about something instead of just relieved that it wasn't another obligation? Something you looked forward to not because it would help you get ahead or because it would make someone else happy, but because it genuinely brought you joy. 4. When was the last time you said no to something without guilt? Not because you had a good excuse or because the timing didn't work out, but because you didn't want to do it and you trusted that your reasons were enough. 5. When was the last time you felt like yourself? Not the version of you that shows up for work or family or friends, but the person you are when no one's watching and you don't have to perform or manage anyone else's expectations. If your answers to most of those questions are, "I don't know," or "I can't remember," that's a sign that you've been living away from your baseline for a long time. It doesn't mean you're broken or that you'll never get back there. It just means that the storm has been loud enough and long enough that you've lost track of what stillness feels like, and finding your way back is going to require more than just waiting for the storm to pass. Think about a time when you did feel grounded, even if it was years ago. Maybe it was a quiet morning before the rest of the house woke up, when you sat with your coffee and didn't think about anything except the taste and the warmth of the cup in your hands. Maybe it was a conversation with someone who really listened, where you didn't have to explain yourself or justify your feelings because they already understood. Maybe it was a moment alone in nature, walking through a park or sitting by water, where the noise in your head finally quieted down and you remembered what it felt like to just exist without trying to fix or manage or control anything. That feeling, whatever it was for you, is your baseline. It's not a fantasy or an impossible standard. It's a real state that you've experienced before, which means it's a state you can experience again. The fact that you've lost touch with it doesn't mean it's gone. It means the storm has been loud enough to drown it out, and you've been so busy trying to survive the wind and the rain that you forgot to check whether the roots are still there. They are. Your baseline is still there, buried beneath the noise and the exhaustion and the endless demands. It's waiting for you to stop long enough to remember what it feels like. To recognize that the constant bending isn't normal, and that you deserve to live from a place of stability instead of crisis. Finding it again won't happen overnight, and it won't happen by accident. But it is possible, and it starts with acknowledging that what you're living with right now isn't sustainable, and that somewhere beneath the chaos, there's a version of you that knows how to be still. Chapter 5. How We Lost It and Why You're Not Alone. In 2011, Oprah Winfrey hit a wall. This was a woman who'd built an empire, who'd hosted one of the most successful talk shows in television history for 25 years, who'd become a cultural icon synonymous with wisdom and resilience. And yet, when she launched her own network, the pressure and the scrutiny and the sheer weight of trying to live up to impossible expectations brought her to a breaking point she later described as one of the hardest moments of her life. She talked about it in interviews afterward, describing how she'd been so focused on keeping the network afloat, on proving that she could succeed in this new venture, that she stopped sleeping properly, stopped taking care of herself, and eventually reached a place where she didn't recognize the person she'd become. She used the phrase, hitting a wall, that moment when you realize you've been running so hard for so long that you've lost track of why you started running in the first place. What saved her, she said, wasn't pushing harder or finding a new strategy. It was stepping back, acknowledging that she'd lost herself in the chaos, and making the deliberate choice to find her way back to the person she was beneath all the roles and expectations. If Oprah Winfrey, someone with resources and support most people can't even imagine, can lose her baseline under the weight of stress and expectation, then it's worth understanding that this isn't a personal failing. It's a human one. The baseline isn't something fragile that breaks easily. It's something that gets buried slowly, layer by layer, until you forget it was ever there. Think about the movie The Devil Wears Prada. Andy starts the film as someone who knows what she wants. A young journalist with clear values and a sense of herself that feels solid. Then she takes a job working for Miranda Priestley. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she changes. She stops calling her boyfriend. She misses her best friend's birthday. She dresses differently, talks differently, prioritizes things she used to dismiss as shallow because that's what the job demands. By the time she catches her reflection in a mirror halfway through the film, she doesn't recognize herself anymore. She's become someone she never intended to be, and it happened so gradually that she didn't notice until it was almost too late. That's how most people lose their baseline, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a series of small compromises, tiny adjustments to survive the demands of the world around them. You say yes to one thing you don't want to do because it seems manageable. Then another. Then another. You skip rest because there's too much to handle. You ignore the signals your body sends because acknowledging them would mean admitting you can't keep up. You tell yourself it's temporary, that once you get through this busy season or this difficult project or this challenging phase, you'll slow down and take care of yourself. But the busy season never really ends, and the difficult phase blends into the next one. And before you know it, you've been living at maximum capacity for so long that you can't remember what it felt like to operate any other way. Here's how it happens. You start with something manageable, a job, a relationship, a responsibility that feels important and worth your effort. At first, it energizes you. You're building something, contributing, proving to yourself and others that you're capable. Then the demands increase. More hours, more expectations, more pressure to perform at a level that requires you to stretch beyond what feels comfortable. You stretch because you want to succeed, because you don't want to let people down, because saying no feels like admitting you're not good enough. As the demands grow, something has to give. You start cutting back on the things that don't feel urgent. Sleep, exercise, time with friends, hobbies that used to bring you joy. All of it gets pushed aside because there's always something more pressing. You tell yourself it's fine, that you'll get back to those things later. But later never comes because the list of urgent tasks keeps growing and the space for anything else keeps shrinking. Eventually, you hit a point where you're running on fumes, barely keeping up with what's required of you and unable to think beyond the next deadline or the next crisis. That's when the baseline disappears completely. You're no longer living from a place of stability and making choices that align with who you are. You're in survival mode, reacting to whatever's in front of you and hoping you can hold it together long enough to get through the day. The reasons people lose their baseline vary, but the patterns are consistent. For some, it's career pressure, the belief that success requires total sacrifice, and that taking care of yourself is a luxury you can't afford. For others, it's family obligations, the responsibility of caring for children or aging parents or both, leaving no time or energy for anything that isn't immediately necessary. For others still, it's financial stress, the constant worry about making ends meet that forces them to work longer hours and take on more than they can reasonably handle. And for many, it's a combination of all these things, a perfect storm of demands that pile up until there's no room left for the person buried underneath. What makes it worse is that the world around you doesn't slow down to accommodate your limits. The culture rewards people who push through exhaustion, who sacrifice their well-being for productivity, who keep going no matter what it costs them. It tells you that if you're struggling, it's because you're not managing your time well enough, or you're not resilient enough, or you're just not cut out for this level of responsibility. It doesn't tell you that the system is designed to extract as much from you as possible without regard for what it takes to sustain you, and that losing your baseline isn't a sign of weakness, but a predictable outcome of living in a world that demands more than most people can give indefinitely. The loss doesn't happen all at once, which is why so many people don't notice it until they're already deep in the chaos. You adapt to each new demand, convincing yourself that this is just how life works now. You normalize the exhaustion, the irritability, the sense of always being behind. You look around and see other people managing, or at least appearing to manage, and you assume that what you're feeling is just part of being an adult. What you don't see is that most of those people are struggling too, that they've also lost their baseline and are just better at hiding it or haven't hit the breaking point yet. Here's what the loss looks like in real terms. You wake up tired no matter how much sleep you got. You move through your day on autopilot, checking off tasks without really being present for any of them. You snap at people you care about over small things because you don't have the emotional bandwidth left to manage frustration gracefully. You avoid making decisions because even simple choices feel overwhelming when your brain is already maxed out. You pull away from activities and relationships that used to matter because you don't have the energy to show up in ways that feel meaningful. And beneath all of it, there's a quiet, persistent sense that you're failing, that you should be able to handle this better, that something is fundamentally wrong with you for feeling this way. But there's nothing wrong with you. You're not weak or broken or incapable. You're overloaded. And overload has a cost that compounds over time until your nervous system can't sustain the load anymore. The baseline didn't disappear because you weren't strong enough to hold on to it. It disappeared because the weight you've been carrying is too heavy for anyone to carry indefinitely without breaking. The good news, and this is the part that changes everything, is that the loss isn't permanent. The baseline didn't vanish. It's still there, buried beneath the stress and the exhaustion and the years of pushing yourself beyond your limits. You can find it again, but not by doing more or trying harder. You find it by stepping back, by acknowledging that the way you've been living isn't sustainable, and by making the deliberate choice to rebuild the foundation that's been eroding for so long. Oprah found her way back by stopping, by admitting that she couldn't keep going the way she had been, and that something fundamental needed to change. Andy in The Devil Wears Prada found it by walking away from the job that was consuming her, by choosing herself over the approval of people who didn't care about her well-being. You'll find yours in a way that's specific to your life and your circumstances. But the principle is the same. You can't reclaim your baseline while you're still living at the pace that caused you to lose it. You have to slow down enough to remember what it feels like to be grounded. And then you have to protect that feeling fiercely, because the world will keep demanding more if you let it. The path back starts with recognizing that you're not alone in this, that millions of people are living the same way you are, and struggling with the same feelings of being overwhelmed and disconnected from themselves. It continues with understanding that the baseline isn't something you have to earn or achieve. It's something you already had once and can access again if you're willing to do the work of clearing away the layers that buried it. And it ends, or really begins, with the techniques and practices that will help you find your way back to the part of yourself that knows how to be still, even when the world around you refuses to stop. Chapter 6. When you're in crisis. What actually works in the moment? When you're in the middle of a panic attack, theory doesn't help. Knowing why your amygdala is hijacking your prefrontal cortex doesn't stop your heart from racing or your hands from shaking or the feeling that the walls are closing in and you can't breathe. In that moment, what you need isn't understanding. What you need is something concrete, something you can do right now that will bring your nervous system back down from the edge before it spirals completely out of control. The techniques in this chapter aren't meant to fix the underlying issues that led to your overload. They're emergency tools, the kind you use when you're drowning, and you need to get your head above water long enough to take a breath. Think of them as a first aid kit for your nervous system. Strategies that work in the moment when everything feels like too much and you don't have the capacity to think your way through it. Navy SEALs use a breathing technique called box breathing when they're in high-stress situations, where staying calm could mean the difference between life and death. It's simple, effective, and it works because it gives your body a signal that you're safe, even when your mind is convinced you're under threat. The technique is called box breathing, because it follows a pattern that forms a box. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold, and repeat. Here's how it works. Find a place where you can sit or stand comfortably, somewhere you won't be interrupted for the next few minutes. Close your eyes if that feels safe, or keep them open and focus on a spot in front of you. Breathe in slowly through your nose for a count of 4. Don't rush it. Let the air fill your lungs completely, expanding your chest and your belly. Hold that breath for a count of 4, keeping your body still and your mind focused on the count. Then exhale slowly through your mouth for a count of 4, releasing all the air and letting your shoulders drop. Hold the empty breath for a count of 4 before starting the cycle again. The first time you try this, it might feel awkward or forced, like you're overthinking something that should be automatic. That's normal. Your nervous system is used to shallow, rapid breathing when you're stressed, and switching to deep, controlled breaths takes practice. But if you stay with it, repeating the cycle 4 or 5 times, you'll notice a shift. Your heart rate slows, the tightness in your chest eases. The overwhelming sense of panic starts to recede. not because the stressor disappeared, but because you've given your body a way to regulate itself instead of spiraling further into chaos. The reason this works comes down to physiology. When you're stressed, your sympathetic nervous system activates, the part responsible for fight or flight responses. Your breathing becomes shallow and fast, your heart rate increases, and your body prepares to either attack the threat or run from it. Deep, controlled breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part responsible for rest and recovery. It sends a signal to your brain that the threat has passed, that it's safe to calm down, and that you don't need to stay in crisis mode anymore. Box breathing hijacks that process, tricking your body into relaxing even when your mind is still convinced there's danger. But breathing techniques don't work for everyone in every situation, especially if the panic is so intense that focusing on your breath feels impossible. That's where grounding techniques come in. Grounding pulls you out of your head and back into your body by engaging your senses, forcing your brain to focus on the present moment instead of spiraling into worst-case scenarios or replaying past failures. The 5-4-3-2-1 technique is one of the most effective grounding tools because it's simple enough to use even when you're in the middle of a crisis and your brain feels like it's short-circuiting. It works by asking you to identify things you can perceive with your 5 senses, starting with sight and working your way through the rest. Here's the process. Wherever you are, look around and identify 5 things you can see. Don't just glance at them. Really look. Notice the colors, the shapes, the details you wouldn't normally pay attention to. A crack in the wall, the pattern on someone's shirt, the way the light hits the floor. Name them out loud if you can, or silently in your head if speaking feels too hard. Next, identify 4 things you can touch. Reach out and feel the texture of the fabric on the chair you're sitting in, the cool smoothness of a table, the rough surface of a wall, the warmth of your own hands pressed together. Focus on the sensations, the way each texture feels different, the way your sense of touch anchors you to the physical world. Then find 3 things you can hear. Not the noise inside your head, the thoughts that won't stop looping, but actual sounds in the environment around you. The hum of a refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, someone's footsteps in another room, birds outside, your own breathing. Let each sound register fully before moving to the next one. After that, identify 2 things you can smell. If there's nothing obvious, that's okay. Smell your shirt, your hands, the air around you. Notice what's there even if it's subtle. Coffee, soap, the faint scent of laundry detergent. The goal isn't to find something pleasant, just to engage the sense and pull yourself further into the present. Finally, identify 1 thing you can taste. If you have gum or a mint, use that. If not, notice the taste already in your mouth, whatever it is. The point is to complete the cycle, to move through all 5 senses and give your brain something concrete to focus on instead of the panic. Someone trying this for the first time during a particularly rough day found that halfway through identifying what they could see, the tightness in their chest started to ease. By the time they got to the things they could hear, the panic that had felt suffocating a few minutes earlier had dropped to a manageable hum in the background. It didn't make the stressor go away. The deadline was still looming, and the problem they'd been worrying about hadn't magically solved itself. But it brought them back to the present moment, where they could think clearly enough to take the next step instead of spiraling into catastrophe. The mistake most people make with these techniques is expecting them to eliminate stress entirely. They won't. What they do is interrupt the escalation, the moment when stress turns into panic and panic turns into complete shutdown. They give you a way to reset your nervous system just enough that you can function, that you can make a decision or take an action without being completely hijacked by fear or overwhelm. Another mistake is waiting until you're already in full-blown crisis to try these techniques for the first time. Practice them when you're calm, when your nervous system isn't already maxed out, so that when you do need them in the middle of a hard moment, the process feels familiar instead of foreign. Muscle memory matters here. The more you practice box breathing or grounding when you're relatively stable, the easier it becomes to access those tools when you're anything but stable. These techniques aren't a substitute for addressing the deeper issues that led to your overload in the first place. They're not going to solve the problem of a job that demands too much, or a relationship that drains you, or a schedule that leaves no room for rest. What they do is give you a foothold, a way to stabilize yourself in the moment so that you're not making decisions or reacting to situations from a place of complete dysregulation. They buy you time, space, and a little bit of clarity when everything else feels like chaos. You're not going to master this overnight. The first few times you try box breathing, it might feel forced or ineffective. The first time you attempt the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, you might struggle to focus on anything except the panic. That's okay. These are skills, and like any skill, they get better with practice. What matters is that you have them available when you need them, that you know there's something you can do in the moment when the storm is at its loudest, and the baseline feels impossibly far away. Because the truth is, you can't find your way back to your baseline while you're in the middle of a crisis. You have to stabilize first, to bring your nervous system down from high alert so that you're capable of thinking clearly and making choices that align with who you are instead of who you become when you're overwhelmed. These techniques are the bridge between crisis and calm, the tools that make it possible to take the first step towards something better. Chapter 7. The Dangerous Word, No. How to Simplify Without Guilt. In 2016, Emma Watson did something that shocked her fans and confused a lot of people in Hollywood. At the height of her career, fresh off the success of the Harry Potter franchise and with offers flooding in, she announced that she was taking a year off from acting. Not to work on another project, not to promote something new, just to step back, to stop, to give herself space to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing for an audience. In interviews afterward, she described that year as one of the most important decisions she'd ever made. She talked about how she'd been working nonstop since she was a child, how she'd built her entire identity around being productive and meeting expectations, and how somewhere along the way she'd lost track of what she actually wanted because she'd been so focused on what everyone else needed from her. Taking a year off wasn't about escaping her career. It was about reclaiming herself, about learning that it was okay to say no to opportunities that didn't align with who she was, even if those opportunities looked good on paper. That's the power of no. It's not about rejecting people or burning bridges or refusing to show up for the things that matter. It's about recognizing that your time, your energy, and your well-being have limits, and that protecting those limits is not selfish. It's survival. Most people struggle with no because they've been taught that saying it makes them difficult, ungrateful, or less valuable. They've learned that being accommodating, agreeable, and always available is what earns them approval and keeps them safe. So they say yes to things they don't want to do, things that drain them or pull them further away from their baseline, because the fear of disappointing someone else feels worse than the cost of disappointing themselves. But here's what happens when you can't say no. You end up living a life shaped by other people's priorities instead of your own. Your calendar fills up with obligations that don't serve you, commitments you agreed to out of guilt or habit, or the belief that refusing would make you a bad person. You lose hours, days, weeks to things that don't matter to you. And the resentment builds quietly in the background till one day you realize you don't recognize your own life anymore. Because so little of it actually belongs to you. Sarah spent 15 years saying yes to everything. Yes to hosting holidays, even though she hated the chaos and the pressure. Yes to serving on committees she had no interest in because someone asked and she didn't know how to refuse. Yes to extra projects at work because turning them down felt like admitting she wasn't capable. Yes to favors for friends and family, even when it meant sacrificing the little free time she had left. She told herself she was being kind, that this was what good people did. That if she just kept showing up for everyone else, eventually things would balance out and she'd have space for herself. They didn't. The more she gave, the more people expected, until her life became a series of obligations she'd agreed to out of reflex rather than intention. By the time she hit her mid-40s, she was exhausted, resentful, and so far from her baseline that she couldn't remember the last time she'd done something purely because she wanted to, not because someone else needed her to. The breaking point came during a conversation with her sister, who casually mentioned how nice it must be to have so much free time since Sarah didn't have kids. Sarah laughed, a bitter, hollow sound, and said, "I don't have any free time. I'm busier than you are, and none of it is mine." That was the moment she realized she'd been living her life on autopilot, letting other people's needs dictate her choices because she'd never learned that no was an option. The shift didn't happen overnight. Sarah didn't wake up the next day and start refusing every request that came her way. What she did was start asking herself a simple question every time someone asked her for something. Is this mine? Not, can I do this, or will they be upset if I say no? But, is this something I want to take on? Something that aligns with my priorities? Something that serves me in a way that feels worth the cost? More often than not, the answer was no. The committee she'd been serving on for 3 years? Not hers. The obligation to host Thanksgiving because it had always been at her house? Not hers. The extra work project that would require evenings and weekends? Not hers. Saying no to those things didn't make her selfish. It made space for the things that actually mattered. The time with her partner that had been slipping away. The creative projects she'd been putting off for years. The simple act of resting without guilt. Here's the tool that helped her do it. Before agreeing to anything, she'd pause and ask herself 3 questions. First, is this mine to carry? Or am I taking it on because I feel obligated? Second, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? And third, will doing this move me closer to my baseline or further away from it? The first question cuts through the noise of guilt and expectation and gets to the core of whether something is actually your responsibility. A lot of the obligations people carry don't belong to them. They're things other people want them to do, problems other people expect them to solve, roles other people have assigned them without asking if they're willing to play them. Asking, "Is this mine?" forces you to separate what's actually yours from what you've been carrying out of habit or fear. The second question acknowledges that every yes is also a no. When you say yes to hosting an event you don't want to host, you're saying no to the quiet weekend you needed to recover. When you say yes to a project that doesn't excite you, you're saying no to the time you could have spent on something that does. Your time and energy are finite, and pretending they're not doesn't make more of them magically appear. It just means you spend what you have on things that don't serve you. The third question ties it back to your baseline. If something pulls you closer to the person you are when you're grounded and stable, it's worth considering. If it pulls you further away, if it adds to the overload instead of relieving it, then no matter how good it looks on the surface, It's not serving you. Saying no without guilt requires practice, especially if you've spent years conditioning yourself to accommodate everyone else. The first few times you do it, the guilt will show up. You'll second-guess yourself, worry that you've damaged a relationship or let someone down, replay the conversation in your head, and wonder if you should have handled it differently. That's normal. The guilt doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're breaking a pattern. And your brain doesn't like change, even when the change is good for you. What helps is keeping your no simple. You don't owe anyone a detailed explanation or a justification that makes them feel better about your decision. "I can't take that on right now" is a complete sentence. So is, "That doesn't work for me." The more you explain, the more you give people room to argue or negotiate, and the harder it becomes to hold your boundary. A simple, clear no leaves no space for debate. The other thing that helps is remembering that the people who respect you will understand. They might be disappointed, sure, but they won't hold it against you for taking care of yourself. The people who get angry or guilt-trip you for saying no are usually the ones who've benefited from your inability to set boundaries, and their reaction tells you more about them than it does about you. Try this as a practice. For one day, pay attention to how many times you say yes to something you don't want to do. Don't change your behavior yet, just notice. Notice how often you agree to things out of habit or obligation, how many times you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own, how much of your day gets filled with tasks that don't actually matter to you. Then, the next day, try saying no to one thing, just one. See how it feels. Notice the guilt, the discomfort, the fear that you've done something wrong, and then notice what happens when the world doesn't fall apart, when the relationship survives, when you create a little bit of space in your life that didn't exist before. Saying no isn't about becoming cold or selfish or unavailable. It's about protecting the energy you need to show up for the things that actually matter. It's about recognizing that you can't pour from an empty cup, and that filling your cup requires you to stop giving it away to every person and obligation that asks for it. Emma Watson took a year off, not because she didn't care about her work, but because she cared enough about herself to know she needed space to breathe. Sarah started saying no, not because she stopped loving her family and friends, but because she loved herself enough to stop disappearing into everyone else's needs. You deserve the same. You deserve a life that's shaped by your choices, not by your inability to refuse other people's demands. And the first step toward that life is learning to say the one word that makes space for everything else. No. Chapter 8. Letting go isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself. Go back to the tree standing in the storm. The wind hasn't stopped. The rain keeps coming. But now, imagine something different. Instead of trying to hold on to every branch, every leaf, every part of itself against the force of the wind, the tree starts to let go. A branch that's already dead, cracked and brittle from too many storms, breaks off and falls to the ground. Leaves that can't survive the battering get torn away and scattered. The tree doesn't fight to keep them. It bends with the wind instead of resisting it, releasing the parts that can't make it through so that the core, the trunk, the roots can survive. This isn't weakness. This is survival. The tree that tries to hold on to everything breaks. The tree that learns to let go, to release what it can't sustain, endures. And when the storm finally passes, that tree is still standing, changed but alive, with space for new growth where the dead branches used to be. Letting go works the same way. It's not about giving up on everything or walking away from the things that matter. It's about recognizing that you can't carry everything. That holding on to things that are already breaking you doesn't make you strong. It just makes you heavier. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to release what you were never meant to carry in the first place. People confuse letting go with failure. They think that if they stop fighting for something, if they stop trying to fix a situation or change an outcome, it means they didn't care enough or they weren't resilient enough to see it through. But resilience isn't about grinding yourself down to prove a point. It's about knowing when to bend, when to release, and when to choose yourself over the weight of expectations that were never realistic to begin with. Think about the scene in Frozen where Elsa finally sings "Let It Go." For most of the movie, she's been hiding, suppressing her powers, trying to be the person everyone else needs her to be, even though it's killing her. And then she reaches a breaking point. And instead of continuing to fight against who she is, she lets go. She stops trying to be perfect, to control everything, to please everyone. She releases the need to be something she's not. And in that release, she finds freedom. That's what letting go looks like in practice. It's not about running away or abandoning responsibility. It's about releasing the need to be perfect, to fix everything, to control outcomes you were never going to control anyway. It's about choosing yourself, your well-being, your baseline, over the impossible standards that have been crushing you. Here's what people struggle to let go of. Relationships that stopped serving them years ago, but that they stay in out of guilt or fear or the belief that leaving makes them a quitter. Jobs that drain them, but that they can't walk away from, because they've built their identity around being productive or successful or indispensable. Grudges against people who hurt them. Anger they carry like a badge of honor, even though it's weighing them down, more than it's affecting the person they're angry at. Expectations, their own and others, about who they're supposed to be or what they're supposed to achieve. Standards that were never sustainable, and that keep them running on a treadmill that has no finish line. Letting go of these things doesn't mean they didn't matter. It means you matter more. It means you've reached a point where carrying them is costing you more than releasing them would, and you're finally ready to choose the lighter burden. The technique that helps with this is called release and replace. It's simple in concept, harder in practice, but effective if you stick with it. The idea is that you can't just let go of something without putting something else in its place. Your brain doesn't do well with empty space. If you release a belief or habit or a relationship without replacing it with something intentional, you'll likely fill that space with the same thing you just got rid of, or something equally unhelpful, because your brain defaults to familiar patterns even when those patterns hurt you. Here's how it works. First, identify what you need to let go of. Be specific. Not, "I need to let go of stress," but "I need to let go of the belief that my worth is tied to how much I produce." Or, "I need to let go of the responsibility for my mother's happiness because it's not mine to carry." Write it down if that helps. Get clear on what you're releasing and why. Second, acknowledge the cost of holding on to it. What is this belief, this relationship, this expectation costing you? How is it keeping you from your baseline? Be honest about the damage it's doing, not to guilt yourself, but to understand why letting go is necessary. Third, choose what you're going to replace it with. If you're releasing the belief that your worth comes from productivity, what are you replacing it with? Maybe it's the belief that your worth is inherent, that you don't have to earn it by exhausting yourself. If you're releasing the responsibility for someone else's happiness, what are you replacing it with? Maybe it's the commitment to take care of your own well-being first, to show up for yourself the way you've been showing up for everyone else. Fourth, practice the replacement. This is the part people skip, and it's why letting go often doesn't stick. It's not enough to decide you're releasing something. You have to actively reinforce the new belief, the new habit, the new boundary, until it becomes automatic. That might mean repeating a mantra when the old pattern shows up. It might mean setting a reminder to check in with yourself and ask whether you're honoring the replacement or slipping back into the old way of doing things. It might mean asking for support from someone who can help you stay accountable. Someone trying this with the belief that they had to fix everyone's problems found that the first few weeks were brutal. Every time a friend called with a crisis, the old instinct kicked in, the need to drop everything and solve it for them. But instead of doing that, they practiced the replacement. I can care about you without taking responsibility for fixing this. You're capable, and I trust you to handle it. It felt selfish at first, almost cruel, but over time, it got easier. The friends who respected the boundary adjusted. The ones who didn't showed themselves for what they were, people who valued what they could take more than the relationship itself. Letting go also requires forgiveness, and not just of other people. Most of the weight people carry isn't about what others did to them. It's about what they did to themselves. The mistakes they made, the opportunities they missed, the times they chose wrong or hurt someone they loved or failed to live up to their own expectations. That self-directed anger, that shame, that endless loop of, I should have known better or why did I do that? It's heavier than almost anything else because you can't escape it. It follows you everywhere because you're carrying it inside. Forgiving yourself doesn't mean pretending you didn't mess up. It means acknowledging that you did the best you could with what you knew at the time. That everyone makes mistakes. And that punishing yourself indefinitely doesn't undo the past or make you a better person. It just keeps you stuck in a place where growth isn't possible. Because all your energy goes into beating yourself up instead of moving forward. Here's a practice for that. Write down the thing you're holding against yourself. Not the sanitized version, the real one. What did you do? Who did it hurt? Why does it still weigh on you? Then write what you would say to a friend who came to you with the same story. You wouldn't tell them they're irredeemable or that they deserve to carry that guilt forever. You'd probably tell them that people make mistakes, that they've learned from it, that it's time to let it go and do better moving forward. Give yourself the same grace. Letting go is a practice, not a one-time decision. The things you release will try to come back. The old beliefs, the old patterns, the old guilt, they'll knock on the door and try to convince you that you need them, that life doesn't work without them. And some days, you'll let them back in because the new way is still unfamiliar. And the old way feels safer, even though it's killing you. That's okay. Letting go isn't about perfection. It's about consistently choosing the lighter path, the one that moves you closer to your baseline instead of further away from it. The tree in the storm doesn't hold on to dead branches out of loyalty. It releases them because survival requires it. You're allowed to do the same. You're allowed to let go of the things that are breaking you, even if they once mattered, even if letting go feels like admitting defeat. It's not defeat. It's choosing to live, instead of slowly dying under the weight of everything you were never meant to carry. Chapter 9. Coming Back to Life, Reconnecting with What Matters. Ryan Reynolds has talked openly in interviews about living with anxiety for most of his life. In a 2018 conversation with Variety, he described how anxiety had been a constant companion since he was a kid, something that would show up unannounced and derail him even when everything looked fine on the outside. What struck people about his honesty was how he framed it. He didn't talk about fighting the anxiety or trying to eliminate it. He talked about learning to live with it, about finding his baseline not by conquering his nervous system, but by accepting that some level of stress would always be there and learning how to function alongside it instead of being consumed by it. That's reconnection in practice. Finding your way back to your baseline doesn't mean arriving at a place where nothing bothers you and life runs smoothly all the time. It means reconnecting with the part of yourself that can hold difficulty without falling apart, that can feel anxious or overwhelmed or uncertain, and still move forward. It means remembering what matters to you beneath the noise, and building a life that reflects those priorities instead of constantly reacting to whatever crisis demands your attention. Reconnection starts with stillness. You can't hear what matters to you when you're moving at full speed, when every minute of your day is accounted for and there's no space to think or feel or just exist without an agenda. Most people avoid stillness because they're afraid of what they'll find there. They're afraid of the grief they've been postponing, the disappointment they've been ignoring, the realization that they've been living a life that doesn't actually fit them. So they stay busy, filling every moment with tasks and distractions and obligations, because movement feels safer than stopping long enough to look at what's underneath. But stillness is where reconnection happens. It's where you remember who you are when you're not performing, when you're not managing someone else's expectations, when you're not trying to prove anything. Stillness gives you access to the quiet voice that knows what you need, the one that gets drowned out when your life is too loud to hear it. In Pixar's Soul, Joe spends his entire life chasing one goal, the big break that will prove he's made it, that his life has been worth something. He gets so focused on the destination that he misses the moments that make life worth living. The small interactions, the connections, the experiences that don't come with accolades, but that fill you up in ways achievement never can. It's only when he's forced to stop, to step back from the chase, that he realizes the thing he was looking for wasn't in the accomplishment. It was in the living, in the parts of his life he'd been too busy to notice, because he was so fixated on what came next. That's what happens when you lose your baseline. You stop noticing the things that make life feel meaningful because you're too focused on surviving, on getting through the next task, the next day, the next crisis. Reconnection means coming back to those things, not because they're productive or impressive, but because they remind you of who you are and why you're here. Here's a micro practice that helps. Once a day, for 10 minutes, do something that has no purpose other than bringing you back to yourself. Not something that moves you toward a goal or checks off a task on your list. Something that exists purely because it makes you feel grounded. For some people, that's sitting with a cup of coffee in the morning before the house wakes up, paying attention to the warmth of the cup and the taste and the quiet. For others, it's a walk outside without headphones, letting themselves notice the sky and the trees and the way the air feels. For others still, it's sitting in silence, no phone, no distractions, just breathing and letting their mind settle. It sounds simple, almost trivial, but most people can't do it. They sit down with their coffee and immediately pull out their phone. They go for a walk and listen to a podcast because the silence feels uncomfortable. They try to sit in stillness and their brain starts spinning with all the things they should be doing instead. That resistance, that inability to just be without doing, is a sign of how disconnected you've become from your baseline. And the only way back is through practice, through repeatedly choosing the stillness, even when it feels useless or uncomfortable or like a waste of time. Reconnection also means re-engaging with the people and things that matter to you in ways that feel genuine instead of obligatory. A lot of relationships suffer when you're overloaded because you stop showing up as yourself. You show up as the version of you that's exhausted, resentful, or going through the motions because you don't have the energy to do anything else. The people you care about feel it, even if they don't say it. And over time, the distance grows until you're physically present, but emotionally absent. Coming back means showing up differently. It means calling a friend not because you need something or because it's been too long and you feel guilty, but because you actually want to hear their voice and connect with them. It means spending time with your partner or your kids in a way that's present, where you're not thinking about work or scrolling through your phone or counting down the minutes until you can be alone again. It means doing things that don't serve a function other than making you feel alive. Going to a concert, taking a class, trying something new. Not because it will help your career or make you more productive, but because it fills a part of you that's been empty for too long. Another micro practice. Once a week, do something that used to bring you joy before life got so heavy. Maybe it was reading fiction, painting, playing an instrument, cooking a meal that took hours just because you enjoyed the process. Whatever it was, carve out time for it. Not eventually, not when things calm down, but this week. If your first instinct is, I don't have time for that, that's exactly why you need to do it. The things you've cut out to make room for obligations are usually the things that keep you connected to your baseline. And without them, you're running on empty with no way to refill. Reconnection isn't dramatic. It doesn't require quitting your job or moving across the country or making grand gestures that upend your entire life. It happens in small, deliberate choices to prioritize what matters over what's urgent, to choose presence over productivity, to remember that you're a person with needs and desires and a right to take up space in your own life. Someone practicing this found that the hardest part wasn't finding 10 minutes or doing something they used to enjoy. The hardest part was letting go of the guilt that showed up every time they stopped moving. The voice that said they were being selfish, that they should be working or cleaning or helping someone else, instead of sitting with a book or taking a walk or spending time on something that didn't produce a tangible result. That voice gets quieter with practice, but it doesn't disappear overnight. Reconnection requires pushing through the discomfort of doing something for yourself without justifying it or earning it or proving you deserve it. You do deserve it. You deserve to feel like yourself again, to reconnect with the person you are when you're not just surviving. And the path back starts with the small, quiet moments where you choose yourself, where you stop long enough to remember what it feels like to be grounded, and then protect that feeling like it's the most important thing in the world. Because it is. Chapter 10. Your Daily Rhythm. The small things that change. Everything. Finding your baseline. Once doesn't mean you stay there forever. Life keeps happening, stress keeps building, and without a daily practice to reset your nervous system, you'll drift back into overload without even noticing. The difference between people who maintain their baseline and people who lose it again comes down to the small, unglamorous routines they build into their days, the habits that stabilize them when everything else is chaos. Research from University College London found that it takes an average of 66 days for a new behavior to become automatic, to shift from something you have to force yourself to do into something that feels natural. That timeline varies depending on the complexity of the habit and the person, but the principle holds. Change doesn't happen in a single moment of inspiration. It happens through repetition, through showing up for the small things day after day until they stop feeling like effort and start feeling like part of who you are. The rhythm that protects your baseline has two anchors: a morning ritual that sets the tone for your day, and an evening release that clears out what you accumulated before you try to sleep. Neither of these needs to be long or complicated. What matters is that they're consistent, that they give your nervous system a predictable pattern it can rely on when everything else feels unpredictable. A morning ritual doesn't mean waking up at 5 a.m. or meditating for an hour or following some influencer's routine that requires you to completely overhaul your life. It means creating 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you can manage it, where you do something that centers you before the demands of the day start piling up. The specifics don't matter as much as the intention. You're not trying to be productive or check off a task. You're reminding yourself who you are before the world tells you who you need to be. For someone in their late 40s juggling a demanding job and aging parents, the morning ritual looked like this. Wake up, make coffee, sit in the same chair by the window for 15 minutes without touching the phone. Some mornings, that time was spent thinking. Other mornings, it was spent staring out the window at nothing in particular. The content didn't matter. What mattered was the act of claiming that time, of starting the day as a person instead of a productivity machine. For someone else, a parent with young kids and no margin for quiet mornings, the ritual happened differently. Instead of carving out time before everyone woke up, which felt impossible, they used the first 5 minutes after dropping the kids at school. They'd sit in the car in the parking lot, windows down, and do the box breathing technique from Chapter 6. 5 cycles. That was it. But those 5 minutes became the difference between walking into the rest of the day frazzled and walking in grounded. The morning ritual works because it interrupts the pattern of waking up and immediately diving into stress. Most people reach for their phones the moment they open their eyes, scrolling through emails or news or messages that pull them into someone else's agenda before they've even gotten out of bed. That sets the tone for a day where you're reacting instead of choosing, where you're managing other people's priorities instead of protecting your own. A morning ritual, even a short one, creates a buffer. It gives you a few minutes to remember yourself before the noise starts. The evening release serves a different purpose. Your nervous system accumulates stress throughout the day, and if you don't give it a way to discharge that stress before bed, it carries over into your sleep and compounds the next day. The release doesn't have to be elaborate. It just has to signal to your body that the day is done, that it's safe to let go of what you've been carrying. For someone who works in a high-stress environment, the evening release looked like this. 15 minutes of stretching before bed. Not yoga or a full workout, just gentle movement that released the tension stored in their shoulders, their neck, their lower back. While they stretched, they mentally reviewed the day. Not to obsess over what went wrong, but to acknowledge it and then let it go. What happened today stays in today. Tomorrow gets a fresh start. For someone else, the release was journaling. 5 minutes, 3 sentences. One thing that was hard today. One thing they're grateful for. One thing they're letting go of before sleep. The format kept it manageable, and the act of writing it down helped their brain process the day instead of replaying it endlessly while they tried to fall asleep. For another person, it was a 10-minute walk around the block after dinner. No headphones, no agenda, just movement and air and the chance to transition from the day's demands to the quiet of the evening. Walking worked for them because it engaged their body in a way that helped discharge the nervous energy they carried. And the routine became a signal to their brain that work mode was over and rest mode could begin. The specifics of your rituals will look different depending on your life, your schedule, and what works for your nervous system. The key is consistency. Your brain responds to patterns, and when you repeat the same actions at the same time every day, those actions become cues that help your nervous system regulate itself. Morning ritual means it's time to ground. Evening release means it's time to let go. Over time, those cues become automatic, And the work of maintaining your baseline gets easier because your body knows what to expect. Here's what derails most people. They start strong, create rituals that feel good, and then life gets chaotic and they skip a day. Then another. Then a week goes by and they've lost the thread completely. And instead of just picking it back up, they decide they've failed and abandon the whole thing. That's where the 66-day timeline matters. The first 2 months are going to be inconsistent. You're going to forget, get busy, feel too tired. Convince yourself it doesn't matter. That's normal. The habit isn't automatic yet. What matters is that you come back to it, that you treat each day as its own opportunity instead of waiting for the perfect moment to restart. Someone in their mid-50s building these rituals found that the first month was brutal. They'd remember the morning ritual halfway through their commute and feel guilty for missing it. They'd collapse into bed at night, too exhausted to do the evening release, and wake up feeling like they'd failed before the day even started. But they kept coming back. Not perfectly, not every single day, but enough that by the second month, the rituals started to feel less like effort and more like something they actually wanted to do. By the third month, skipping them felt worse than doing them. And that's when the shift happened. The rituals stopped being tasks and started being anchors. The parts of the day that kept them steady when everything else was pulling them off course. Your daily rhythm doesn't fix everything. You're still going to have hard days, stressful weeks, moments where you feel like you're drowning no matter how consistent your rituals are. What the rhythm does is give you a foundation to come back to, a way to reset your nervous system so that the hard days don't compound into hard months and the stress doesn't build into overload. It's maintenance, unglamorous and repetitive, but necessary if you want to stay connected to your baseline instead of drifting away from it again. Start small. Pick one ritual, morning or evening, whichever feels more doable right now. Commit to it for 1 week, not perfectly, just more days than not. Notice what changes. Notice how it feels to start your day grounded or end it released. Then add the second ritual when the first one starts to feel natural. Build the rhythm slowly, piece by piece, until it becomes the structure that holds you even when everything else is falling apart. The small things matter. The 15 minutes in the morning, the 5 minutes at night. The daily choice to prioritize your nervous system over the endless demands that will always be there. These aren't luxuries. They're survival tools. And the people who protect their baseline long-term are the ones who understand that staying grounded requires daily work, that the rhythm you build is what keeps you from losing yourself when the storm picks up again. Chapter 11. 1 month, 3 months, 1 year. What changes change doesn't happen in a straight line. You don't wake up one day suddenly fixed, permanently grounded, with your baseline restored and nothing left to worry about. Recovery from emotional overload happens in stages, each one bringing different challenges and different rewards. And knowing what to expect at each stage makes it easier to stay consistent when the progress feels slow or invisible. The timeline matters because most people quit too early. They start doing the work, implementing the techniques, building the rituals, and when they don't feel dramatically better after 2 weeks, they assume it's not working and abandon the effort. Understanding that meaningful change takes months, not days, helps you push through the periods where nothing seems to be shifting, even though the foundation is quietly rebuilding beneath the surface. Research on habit formation shows that it takes an average of 66 days for a new behavior to become automatic. But that's just the beginning. 66 days gets you to the point where the ritual feels natural, where you're no longer forcing yourself to do it every single day. What it doesn't do is erase decades of overload or rewire your nervous system overnight. That takes longer, and the timeline unfolds in predictable patterns if you know what to look for. Month 1. The uncomfortable beginning. The first month is the hardest because you're doing all the work without seeing much in the way of results. You're practicing box breathing when you're anxious, saying no to obligations that don't serve you, carving out time for morning rituals and evening releases. And most days it feels like you're going through the motions without anything actually changing. The anxiety still shows up. The exhaustion is still there. The overwhelming sense that you're failing at everything hasn't gone anywhere. This is normal. The first month is about building the structure, not seeing the payoff. You're teaching your nervous system new patterns, and your brain doesn't trust them yet because they're unfamiliar. It's still defaulting to the old ways of reacting, the patterns you've been running for years or decades. What's happening beneath the surface is that you're creating neural pathways, strengthening the connections that support the new behaviors, even though those pathways aren't strong enough yet to override the old ones. Expect inconsistency. You'll forget the morning ritual some days. You'll say yes to things you meant to say no to. You'll skip the evening release because you're too tired or too busy or convinced it doesn't matter. That's part of the process. What matters is that you keep coming back, that you treat each day as its own opportunity instead of letting a bad day derail the entire effort. Someone in their early 50s working through the first month described it as feeling like they were doing everything wrong. They'd practice the grounding techniques and still have panic attacks. They'd set boundaries and feel guilty about it for days. They'd build the daily rituals and then miss 3 days in a row and feel like a failure. But they kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing the new patterns, even when they didn't feel like they were making a difference. That persistence, even when it felt pointless, was what carried them into the second month where things started to shift. Month 3. The quiet shifts. By the third month, something changes. The rituals start to feel less like tasks you're forcing yourself to do, and more like parts of your day you actually want. The techniques you practiced in month 1, the ones that felt awkward or ineffective, start working more consistently. You notice that the panic attacks are less frequent, that the anxiety doesn't spiral as quickly, that you're recovering from stressful events faster than you used to. The changes at this stage are subtle. You're not suddenly calm all the time or free from stress. What happens is that your baseline starts to stabilize. You have more good days than bad days, and the bad days don't knock you as far off course as they used to. You're still dealing with the same external stressors, the same difficult job or complicated relationships or financial pressures. But your internal response to them is different. You're less reactive, more capable of holding difficulty without immediately falling apart. This is also when other people start to notice. A partner might comment that you seem less on edge. A friend might mention that you're easier to talk to, that you're more present in conversations instead of distracted or overwhelmed. You might not feel dramatically different yet, but the people around you can see that something has shifted, that you're showing up differently even if you can't fully articulate how. Expect setbacks. Month 3 doesn't mean smooth sailing from here on out. You'll still have days where you feel like you're back at square one, where the old patterns take over and you snap at someone or say yes when you meant to say no or skip the rituals because life got chaotic. The difference is that those setbacks don't wipe out the progress you've made. You recover faster. You recognize what's happening and adjust instead of spiraling into self-blame or giving up completely. Someone working through their third month found that the biggest shift wasn't in how they felt moment to moment, but in how they responded to difficulty. A situation that would have sent them into a full meltdown 2 months earlier now triggered anxiety. Sure, but manageable anxiety. They could feel it, name it, use the techniques to bring it down, and then move forward instead of being paralyzed by it. That ability to function through difficulty instead of being consumed by it was the first real sign that their baseline was coming back. Year 1. Stability and vigilance. By the end of the first year, the baseline feels like something you can rely on instead of something you're constantly chasing. The rituals are automatic. The techniques are second nature. You've been through enough stressful events by now to know that you can handle them without falling apart completely. And that knowledge creates a kind of confidence you didn't have before. The relationship with stress changes. You're not trying to eliminate it or avoid it anymore, because you've learned that stress is part of life and that your nervous system can handle it as long as you're giving it the tools to reset. You know what throws you off balance, and you know how to get back to center when it happens. The baseline isn't perfect or permanent, but it's accessible in ways it wasn't when you were deep in overload. What also happens at this stage is that you start to see the cost of slipping back into old patterns. If you skip the rituals for a week, you feel it. If you start saying yes to everything again, the overload creeps back faster than you expect. The difference now is that you catch it earlier. You notice when you're drifting away from your baseline, and you have the tools to course correct before it turns into a crisis. Vigilance matters here. Year 1 doesn't mean you've arrived at a place where you can stop doing the work. It means the work has become sustainable. That maintaining your baseline requires consistent effort, but not the exhausting, grinding effort it took in the first few months. You're not fighting to survive anymore. You're managing, adjusting, protecting what you've built. Someone reflecting on their first year said the strangest part was realizing how much of their life used to be spent in crisis mode. Looking back, they could see how constantly they'd been on edge. How little space there had been for anything other than reacting to the next problem. A year in, that constant hum of panic was gone. Life was still hard, still full of challenges and stress and things that didn't go the way they wanted, but they had space to breathe through it instead of drowning in it. The timeline brings real improvements, but it doesn't erase everything. You're still going to have hard days. You're still going to feel overwhelmed sometimes, anxious sometimes, like you're failing sometimes. The baseline isn't a magic state where nothing bothers you. What it is a place you can return to when life knocks you off course. A foundation stable enough to hold you even when everything else is chaos. Expectations matter. If you go into this thinking that a year of consistent work will make you immune to stress or transform you into someone who never struggles, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. What the year does is give you tools, patterns, and a nervous system that can regulate itself instead of staying stuck in crisis mode indefinitely. That's not nothing. That's the difference between surviving and living. The people who maintain their baseline long-term are the ones who understand that this is ongoing work, that there's no finish line where you get to stop showing up for yourself. The rituals, the boundaries, the techniques, they're not temporary fixes. They're the structure that keeps you grounded, and they require daily attention even after the first year, even after the patterns feel automatic. The cost of slipping back is too high, and the reward of staying consistent is a life where you feel like yourself instead of a version of you that's been buried under years of overload. 1 month gets you started. 3 months shows you it's working. 1 year makes it sustainable. And every day after that is a choice to keep protecting what you've built, to keep choosing your baseline over the noise that will always try to pull you away from it. Chapter 12. The real cost. What happens if you don't? The storm eventually passes. It always does. The wind dies down, the rain stops, and the air grows still again. When that happens, the tree that bent with the storm, that released the branches it couldn't save and protected its roots, stands changed but alive. Some parts are missing. The shape is different than it was before. But the roots are deeper now, stronger from holding on through the chaos, and there's space for new growth where the dead weight used to be. The tree that tried to hold on to everything, that fought the wind instead of bending with it, that refused to let go of anything even when the weight became unbearable, doesn't look the same when the storm passes. It's broken, cracked, hollow in places where the strain became too much. And when the next storm comes, because there's always a next storm, it doesn't have the strength left to survive it. That's the cost of ignoring your baseline, of living in overload for so long that you forget there's any other way to exist. The damage compounds, the cracks spread, and eventually, something breaks that can't be fixed by just deciding to rest for a weekend or take a vacation or power through one more month until things calm down. Things don't calm down. They just keep taking until there's nothing left to give. Robin Williams spent decades making people laugh, bringing joy to millions, building a career that looked from the outside like the definition of success. But the people who knew him talked about the weight he carried, the depression and anxiety that followed him even when he was performing, even when the audience was cheering. In 2014, he took his own life, and the world was shocked because how could someone so talented, so beloved, be suffering that much without anyone seeing it? The answer is that suffering doesn't always look like what people expect. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as the person who's always smiling, always accommodating, always showing up for everyone else, because that's easier than admitting they're drowning. Williams talked openly in interviews about his struggles. But talking about something and getting the help you need to address it are two different things. And sometimes, the overload becomes so complete that the person carrying it can't see a way out anymore. This isn't meant to be morbid or to suggest that everyone who's overwhelmed is heading toward the same outcome. Most people don't reach that point. But the cost is real, and pretending it isn't. Convincing yourself that you can keep running on empty indefinitely without consequences is dangerous. The baseline doesn't just affect how you feel on a day-to-day basis. It affects your health, your relationships, your ability to function, and eventually, if you ignore it long enough, your will to keep going. Consider two people who started in similar places. Both were in their mid-40s, both juggling demanding jobs and families, both overloaded to the point where they couldn't remember the last time they felt like themselves. The difference was in what they did next. The first person recognized that something had to change. They started small, adding a morning ritual, practicing grounding techniques when the anxiety spiked, saying no to obligations that didn't serve them. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen fast. But over the course of a year, their life shifted. The baseline stabilized. The panic attacks became less frequent. The relationships that had been fraying started to heal because they were showing up as a person instead of a shell of one. They still had hard days, still dealt with stress and difficulty. But they had tools now, and they knew how to reset their nervous system instead of letting it stay maxed out indefinitely. The second person kept pushing. They told themselves they didn't have time for rituals or boundaries, that they'd deal with the overload later when things slowed down. But things didn't slow down. The job got more demanding. The family needed more from them. The stress kept building, and instead of addressing it, they just kept going. Kept saying yes. Kept ignoring the signs that their body and mind were giving them. By the time they hit 50, they were on medication for high blood pressure. Their marriage was falling apart, and they developed chronic pain that no doctor could fully explain because it was their nervous system manifesting years of unprocessed stress in physical form. The cost showed up differently for each of them, but the trajectory was clear. One chose to protect their baseline, and it gave them a life they could actually live instead of just survive. The other kept ignoring it, and the overload extracted a price that compounded over time until it affected everything. The real cost isn't just what you lose in the moment. It's what you lose over the years. The relationships that deteriorate because you're too exhausted to show up for them. The health issues that develop because your body can't sustain chronic stress indefinitely. The sense of yourself that disappears so gradually you don't notice it's gone until you look in the mirror one day and don't recognize the person staring back. The opportunities you miss because you're too burned out to take them. The life you could have lived that gets buried under the weight of obligations and expectations you never questioned. People justify the overload because it feels necessary. They tell themselves they don't have a choice, that this is just what life requires, that everyone else is managing, so they should be able to as well. But managing isn't the same as thriving, and surviving isn't the same as living. You can white-knuckle your way through years of overload and still be standing at the end. But what's left of you when you get there? What's left of your relationships, your health, your ability to feel joy or connection or anything other than exhaustion? The tree in the storm had a choice. It could fight the wind and break, or it could bend and survive. You have the same choice. You can keep ignoring your baseline. Keep pushing yourself beyond what's sustainable. Keep telling yourself that rest and boundaries and self-care are luxuries you can't afford. Or you can start doing the work now, building the rituals, learning the techniques, protecting the foundation that keeps you grounded even when life gets loud. The cost of doing the work is time, effort, and the discomfort of changing patterns you've been running for years. The cost of not doing it is everything. Your health, your relationships, your sense of yourself. The ability to live a life that feels like yours instead of one you're just enduring until it's over. Robin Williams is gone, and the world lost something irreplaceable when he decided he couldn't carry the weight anymore. You don't have to end up there. The overload doesn't have to win, but you have to choose differently. You have to choose your baseline over the noise, your well-being over the endless demands, yourself over the version of you that's been buried under years of trying to be everything for everyone. The storm will pass. The question is, what's left of you when it does? Conclusion. The air is still. The storm has passed. The wind has stopped howling. The rain has moved on. And the tree, the one that learned to bend instead of break, stands in the quiet that follows. The branches are different now. Some are missing, released during the worst of the storm because holding on to them would have cost too much. The shape has changed. But the roots, those deep, anchoring roots that held steady when everything above ground was chaos, are stronger than they were before. They've dug deeper into the earth, finding new stability in the places where the storm tried to pull them loose. There's space now. Space where the dead branches used to be. Space for new growth. For leaves that will come when the season is right. The tree didn't survive by resisting the storm. It survived by learning when to hold on and when to let go. By protecting what mattered most, even when that meant losing parts of itself along the way. And now, in the stillness, it can rest. It can remember what it feels like to stand upright, without the constant pressure of the wind trying to knock it down. Your baseline is like that. It's the place you return to when the noise finally stops. When you've done the work of releasing what you couldn't carry and protecting the foundation that keeps you grounded. Finding it doesn't mean the storms are over. Life will keep happening, stress will keep building, and there will be days when the wind picks up again and you have to decide whether you're going to bend or break. But you'll know how to bend now. You'll know that surviving doesn't mean holding on to everything, that resilience isn't measured by how much weight you can carry, but by how well you can recover when the weight becomes too much. You've read about the science, the stories, the techniques. You've learned why overload happens, what it does to your brain and your body, and how the culture you live in is designed to keep you running until you burn out. You've seen examples of people who found their way back and people who didn't, who kept pushing until there was nothing left to push with. You've been given tools, small practices that don't require hours of your time or a complete overhaul of your life. Just consistent effort and the willingness to choose differently. Now comes the part where you decide what to do with all of that. You can close this book and go back to the way things were, convincing yourself that you'll deal with the overload later when you have more time or energy, or when life slows down enough to make space for it. Or you can start today, right now, with one small action that moves you closer to your baseline instead of further away from it. Here's what that action looks like. Before you go to bed tonight, take 5 minutes to do the evening release from Chapter 10. It doesn't matter if you've been doing it all along or if this is the first time. What matters is that you do it tonight. Stretch, journal, walk, whatever version feels manageable. Let your nervous system discharge the stress you've been carrying today so that it doesn't carry over into tomorrow. That's it. 5 minutes. One practice. One choice to prioritize your well-being over the belief that you don't have time or that it won't make a difference. Tomorrow, if you wake up and you're still here, still willing to try, add the morning ritual. 15 minutes before the demands start piling up. Before you reach for your phone or dive into your inbox or start managing everyone else's needs. 15 minutes to remind yourself who you are when you're not performing, when you're not reacting, when you're just a person sitting in the quiet and choosing to be present. That's how it starts. Not with a dramatic transformation or a perfect plan, but with small, unglamorous choices repeated often enough that they stop feeling like effort and start feeling like who you are. The baseline doesn't come back all at once. It comes back in pieces, in moments where you notice that you handled a stressful situation without spiraling, where you said no without guilt, where you felt like yourself for the first time in longer than you can remember. You're allowed to want that. You're allowed to choose yourself, to protect your energy, to build a life that feels sustainable instead of suffocating. You're allowed to rest without earning it, to set boundaries without justifying them, to prioritize your well-being over the expectations that have been crushing you. You don't have to wait until you've proven you deserve it or until you've accomplished enough to make it okay. You deserve it now, as you are, with all the mess and the mistakes and the years of overload you've been carrying. The roots are still there. Even if you can't feel them right now, even if it's been so long since you felt grounded that you've forgotten what it's like, they're still there. Buried beneath the noise, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the endless demands that have been drowning out everything else. You haven't lost yourself. You've just been living so far from your baseline that you forgot what it feels like to come home. This is your invitation to come home, to stop bending under the weight of a storm that never needed to last this long, to remember that the tree survives by protecting its roots, and that you survive the same way. Start small. Start tonight. Start with 5 minutes and see what happens when you choose yourself over the chaos. When you protect your baseline, instead of giving it away to every person and obligation that asks for it. The air is still. The storm has passed. And you're still standing. That's not nothing. That's everything. Now the work begins. The quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding what the storm tried to take from you. You don't have to do it perfectly. You just have to start